Black has a lot more pawns there. You can try and trade off, isolate some of your enemy pawns, and create some targets for your pieces a bit later. For now, though, it just looks like pure maneuvering. Both sides setting up their rooks, getting ready. The white queen dropping back, very mysterious. But I think we'll see the status quo maintained for the next 15, 20 moves, and then the fire be unleashed.
And what about if you're playing with the black pieces here, Tanya? Are there any particular outposts or pawn advances that could be committal or anything of the sort that you're particularly watching out for?
Well, this is the minority attack that David was earlier implying about, right? Magnus using his 2 pawns on that queen's flank to get those open lines in. You mentioned outpost. If you're allowed to breathe fire down, Magnus will use that knight and jump to the c5 square. Yep. Any trades would open up some lines in favor of Magnus. We see some pawn trades here. The rook was attacking the queen moves, and look at that, Magnus doubling down on that c5 square. He pushes the pawn. That b4 pawn contains the pawn chain that Nodirbek has on the queen side. Okay, so a reasonable amount of pressure being applied early on. Not exactly like this isn't going to be, backbreaking or anything like that, but we're asking questions and we're trying to give our opponent the opportunity to make mistakes. Those mistakes aren't happening. We just want to start introducing the potential cracks in the armor, looking for first, maybe second weaknesses. Let's see what's going on the other side of the board and poking and prodding to see where the position could be weaker.
Exactly. It's just accumulating small advantages. First, you want to isolate one of your opponent's pawns. Then you want to maybe trade off the correct set of pieces. Only then do you start looking for a plan of action. First, we see a rook trade, Nodirbek pausing. Slightly surprising that he decides not to instantly recapture or even pre-mover recapture, maybe thinking about trading knights first. But there we go. Knights do drop off the board on Magnus's terms, and the knight leaps forward.
And now we could potentially see an imbalance appear in the position. If you take that knight, which has just moved forward, that would mean the B pawn. You always want a flank pawn towards the center. That's how you want to capture, opening up a B line, a direct path to Nodirbek's b7 weakness there.
And I'm going to guess that the pawn on b4 is absolutely nowhere close for the taking because of rook b... Well, whole bunch of moves starting with rook b1, I'm going to guess.
Yeah, for now the black knight is hit as well, so there's not quite time for the black queen to go pawn hunting. I would advocate for not taking that white knight. I've banged on about this too much in my chess career, but connect 4 is the perfect pawn structure. White's b-pawn taking and replacing that white knight on c5 would set up an unbreakable wall that black will never break through. So keeping the knights on the board, at least trying to improve the black knight here, a good decision. He's going for that white b-pawn on the b4 square.
And this is getting extremely concrete now, because Magnus better have something up his sleeves. He does capture the central pawn. He's given Nodirbek a b-passer, which can start moving up the board. Magnus is relying on his central pawns eventually moving forward. Perhaps some attacking ideas as well. The white queen going to the g4 square, lining up against the king, with some checkmating patterns developing with the knight maneuvering eventually. This is becoming tricky for both players. He goes back instead with the knight to c5.
It certainly looks like we're setting up to say, you know what, let's play an endgame. White's got 1 pawn island, black's got 2. Who is going to be more comfortable potentially pushing for a win in that sort of scenario? Is there any way to isolate a black pawn and play against that in the end? This is all getting rather technical.
Yeah, getting rather technical, and one of our fans there in the audience working with his technology on the phone there. But in the meantime, I think it's all about which pieces to trade. If queens come off the board, it's unclear who benefits. It's probably the side who can attack the enemy pawns with their rooks. If knights disappear, I think that really helps black. The white knight's so active right now. Bishop for knight trade is available for Nodirbek. He can remove that knight from the board. But then the black king loses its best defender if the f8 bishop disappears. It's just a series of very small questions. Ultimately, alone, one trade might not change the balance too much, but if you leave your opponent with the superior pieces in the endgame, that could be decisive.
And you want to be able to get activity for white by playing moves like queen out to g4, but then you allow the black queen to move in and get really active and start harassing the rook as well. So it feels really unclear, and it's almost one of those games where whatever you do, keep everything active. You can't afford a passive move.
Exactly. And a trade there. It's queen and knight versus queen and bishop, a big imbalance now, and activity is the name of the game. The queen and knight hold their own because they control a lot of central squares.
And honestly, both combos look very tempting. You know, the black queen and knight on those light squares, really nicely planted. The black knight has a beautiful outpost, cannot be kicked out. Magnus's bishop doing a fantastic job on the longest diagonal on the board as well. Extremely active, plus defending its own pawns. That is the big imbalance here, and it's coming to the point of just asking these small questions. That's just what Magnus Carlsen does best. You know, keeps probing his opponent just little by little. It almost feels inconsequential. It's somehow gaining that little time on the clock, gaining that little advantage, those strategic points. There's a b7 weakness. Watch out for that. But right now, we've got Nodirbek, who lines up his own rook against the white queen. For Magnus, the big question would be, does he want queens on the board or off the board?
That's I love the way you summed that up about Magnus, Tanya. With a lot of players and a lot of games, it's, oh, look, there's a big mistake. Here's a positional weakness that's been introduced that we can target in 4 or 5 moves' time. Magnus plays these subtle, maneuvering, grinding moves where you don't understand why that's useful until 12, 15, 20 moves later, and then it all sort of clicks into place. It becomes clear. He's a master at being able to do that to anyone on the planet.
And you have to take 20 right decisions of these small questions being asked. And that's the tough part about facing Magnus. David, we often talk about the Magnus touch in the endgame. He does decide to trade the queens off the board. Are we going to see a vintage Magnus grind here?
Well, the ingredients are there, but Magnus did a bit of a double take. He missed this last move, potentially. The black knight blocking the power of the white rook. The bishop in the center of the board is next on the menu. If you move the white bishop away, the black rook gets in. So it does feel like, objectively, Nodirbek totally fine, but we have seen Magnus squeezing water out of that stone so many times before, gaining space, pushing pawns, ready for any potential pawn race later. I'm going to say a draw much more likely than a Magnus grind here specifically, just because Nodirbek has enough time on the clock, but you never know. We've seen it before.
We've said it possibly hundreds of times. I'm sure some people have said it thousands of times, where the eval bar, dead draw, dead draw, dead draw, squeezing just a tiny bit, and then a little bit more, and it's like a snowball that becomes an avalanche, and Magnus just finds a way to conjure those out of nowhere.
It's just unbelievable, right? It's a draw until it's not, and you don't even know where it all slipped away. But so far, Nodirbek's doing a great job of keeping everything under control. That knight is a beautiful attacker, also a defender, just completely restricts Magnus's rooks, also takes away some key squares from the bishop. Meanwhile, he's using his rook for activity. The clocks, yes, Magnus has got an advantage, but 4.5 minutes still feels like should be enough for Nodirbek. But look at that, Magnus, he's pushing the pawns in the center, you know, once again, asking questions. Are you scared? I'm going to push that just a little bit more.
Exactly. Poking and prodding, going, okay, not much going on here. I accept there's not much going on. Let's make something go on. And that's just Magnus's attitude to every position. And he does that when he's in worse positions as well. And you think, hang on a second, this is about to flip. I thought I was the one who's supposed to be pressing, yet he's pressing me. We've seen him do that to so many people before. So yeah, very, very dangerous player, and #1 in the world for good reason.
In the meantime, Magnus asks another difficult question. Do you want to trade rooks or not? Black would be justified in going back. There we go. He does retreat. Magnus looks surprised on the camera there. But a rook trade, I think, would have been totally fine as well for Nodirbek. Black has a fortress. Very difficult to break through past the black knight. But Nodirbek wants the tension. And here we go. Pawns on light squares. Bishop controls dark squares. That is classic Magnus Carlsen strategy. And it feels like Nodirbek is just waiting here. He's playing the waiting game, Tanya.
Doesn't have much of a choice, right? The knight is ideally placed, the rook maximized for black as well, also in the open line, the king centralized. For Magnus, the big question is, can he strike in the center with that e-pawn moving forward? Who will those trades benefit? That's the key in this position, right? That Magnus holds the break. He's the one who'll decide when to open up the position, and he decides it's right now.
Okay, that doesn't come without risk. Magnus Carlsen, he's going for it. The black pawns were hit there on the king side, but now the black rook has access into the white position. There we go. It attacks the white isolated pawn on c5, and Magnus goes in with his rook. This is already narrowing the margin for error. The black rook here can grab a pawn, but then the white rook gets into the 7th rank. Rook and bishop combine so well, and it's already a blunder by Nodirbek.
And this is what happens every single time. All those little questions. Finally, this moment, and Magnus Carlsen out of nowhere is winning. The rook about to land on the 7th rank. The pawn beautifully placed. The bishop centralized. There's a check, and you can see panic on Nodirbek.
He gives a check, but en passant here, taking that pawn as if it just moved one square. They say it's a streamer's favorite move, but that is also the most effective move. There we go. Magnus has tripled pawns on the G-file, but if you take that pawn back for Nodirbek, your king is caught in a mating net. The white rook will slide down to the 7th rank, end up on G7. Magnus looks happy. He's winning.
He's got all the reasons, and now suddenly Nodirbek's knight completely offside, far away from defending the king. I mean, that would just lead to checkmate, a pattern we saw Hikaru deliver with his own rook and knight against Satorov. And we ask ourselves, how did this even happen?
You see the furrowed brow there on the face of Abdu Satorov. He's going, hang on a second, what on earth happened here? Like you said, Tony, it's a draw until it isn't. And Magnus looking pretty chilled out with proceedings, but wow, what a way to squeeze an unbelievable win out of this game. Well, let me rephrase that. Unbelievable if it was any other player. For Magnus, it's called Tuesday.
Yeah, most of us would have just repeated the position, done nothing, acquiesced to the draw. Instead, the black rook there had to give itself up for the white bishop because Magnus, out of nowhere, magically created that mating net. The white rook was about to land on G7. Now it's a clean-up job. The black knight has a couple of squares to jump to, a couple of checks, but ultimately will not be able to stem the tide. The white rook is going to be so effective here at cleaning up the black pawns, which are separated and isolated.
Nodirbek also completely in disbelief. He just keeps shaking his head. A position totally in control for the black pieces, for Nodirbek. Played a beautiful game, really. You know, kept everything intact. The knight, rook, playing brilliantly, and then suddenly out of nowhere, is getting checkmated, has to give up his rook. He can give a few more checks, but that's really not going to help. Magnus can decide to centralize his king. That look from Nodirbek is one of a player giving up. He realizes there's barely anything to fight for. You pick up that pawn that's on the left side, put it closer to the H pawn, yes, you can play on. But right now, with the pawns just being so far apart, one of them about to fall, I think Nodirbek's about to fall.
Tell from the body language here. Although surprisingly, stone cold, 88 BPM on heart rate. It's lower than Magnus's at the moment. Unbelievably fit. But unfortunately, you can't say the same for the position. So right now, things looking like they are collapsing for Nodirbek, almost reliant on an extremely rare and uncharacteristic blunder from Magnus. I think this is going to be 1-0 very, very shortly.
Landing some knight forks there was Nodirbek's goal. Be careful, the black knight jumping back with a check so he keeps his rook and king on opposite color complexes. That's how to avoid knight forks. If you keep one piece on a light square, one piece on a dark square, they can't get hit simultaneously, and the black knight now has to give way. The black c-pawn dropping, and Nodirbek resigns.
Wow, absolutely fantastic stuff from Magnus. Was it a vintage Magnus grind? Perhaps not.